Imagine standing in a candlelit drawing room in Victorian London, surrounded by aristocrats sipping port and fanning themselves with opera tickets, while you, the hired help, slowly peel rotting linen off a 3,000-year-old corpse. Welcome to the surprisingly fashionable, unsanitary, and morally questionable world of 19th-century mummy unwrapping parties, where science met spectacle, and the dead had no say in the guest list. This isn't just the story of you, the unfortunate mummy unwrapper. It's the bizarre tale of how Western obsession turned ancient dignity into entertainment. Buckle up, things are about to get dusty. If you've ever wanted a bedtime story that includes dead pharaohs, grave-robbing nobles, and the occasional lung flung across the room, go ahead. Hit that subscribe button, you'll need. Picture this. You're crouched in the drawing room of a bloated aristocrat's townhouse in Mayfair, 1842. Your knees ache. Your hands stink of cheap gin and embalming resin. There's a half-unwrapped mummy lying in front of you, his arms folded like he's bracing for whatever's coming next, which, given the crowd of wine-buzzed guests peering over your shoulder, is probably fair. You're not an Egyptologist. You're not even fully sure what Egyptologist means. You're a nobody. A porter. A dock worker with 3 missing teeth, and a gambling debt taller than a pyramid. But tonight, you're the expert, paid the handsome sum of 1 shilling, 2 pints, and a bowl of stew to perform what the invitation called an intimate evening of ancient enlightenment. What it actually is: a party. A deeply inappropriate, slightly terrifying corpse-rummaging party. Welcome to Victorian London, where boredom among the upper class reached such astronomical levels that watching someone peel gauze off a 3,000-year-old corpse became the hottest post-dinner entertainment in town. And guess who's holding the scalpel? Of course, no one asked the mummy's opinion. If he could speak, he might say something like, "Excuse me, I was promised eternal rest, not a staring contest with the Duke of Wessex and his mistress." But alas, this is Britain, and the dead, especially foreign dead, don't get much of a say. You mutter a prayer, or maybe it's just a cough. Hard to tell, under all the pipe smoke. The crowd leans in. Lord Peabody, rotund and red-faced, fans himself with a silk program labelled, "One Night Only, Secrets of the Sarcophagus." He burps loudly. Somewhere, a piano tinkles out a hesitant tune. The smell. A heady cocktail of beeswax candles, cheap perfume, brandy fumes, and the unmistakable stench of desiccated flesh. It's the kind of ambience that screams history, but make it unsettling. You weren't always unwrapping cadavers. Last year you were moving coal. The year before that, you were briefly employed at a fishmonger's stall, until a misunderstanding involving eels got you blacklisted. So when a wiry man in a ridiculous waistcoat offered you work handling foreign antiquities, you didn't ask questions, not until your first shift involved prying open a coffin that smelled like sadness and cloves. The pay isn't great, the hours are worse. The trauma, well, let's just say you've started flinching every time someone unwraps a gift. But mummy unwrapping is having a moment. You wouldn't believe the demand. Ever since Napoleon's soldiers stumbled into Egypt and kicked off a frenzy of looting dressed up as scholarship, the British elite have been obsessed with all things ancient and embalmed. Sarcophagi are shipping in by the crate load, traded like fine wine or exotic birds. Tombs are being emptied out faster than you can say cultural appropriation. And as long as people keep buying, the British Empire keeps digging. Or more accurately, stealing. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back to the scene. You ease your knife into the linen wrapping. It resists with a little tear, like a paper bag full of regret. You peel back the first layer, and voila, a sliver of blackened skin beneath, leathery and stretched taut over fragile bones. The crowd murmurs, a mix of delight and mild nausea. One woman faints gently onto a chaise lounge, more from excitement than horror. You keep sawing. Lord Peabody claps his hands. "Marvellous. Simply marvellous. Carry on, my good man." You consider throwing the scalpel at him. Instead, you return to your work. Unwrapping a mummy is a strange blend of surgery, theatre, and desecration. Some do it with pomp and flair, flourishing their blades like opera conductors. Others, like you, keep it quiet. Respectful, almost not out of reverence really, but because you've started to feel watched, as if every corpse you open is silently judging you from beneath its linen shroud. Sometimes they are children. sometimes priests, sometimes nobodies, buried with a scrap of amulet and a dream of peace. But to this crowd, they're party favors, curiosities, paperweights for drawing rooms and conversation starters for women in overly tight corsets. You glance at the mummy's face. The skin has tightened over the skull like old parchment, lips drawn back in what might have once been a smile, or perhaps a scream. The eyes are gone, of course, long since crumbled to dust. You always wonder what they last saw. Probably not this. You pause for a moment, knife poised mid-air. A hush falls over the room. Maybe, just maybe, someone senses the wrongness, the absurdity, the heartbreaking stupidity of digging up a person who believed their soul would be judged in the afterlife, only to be gawked at by people who can't even spell Pharaoh. But no, someone sneezes. A servant refills a wine glass. The pianist strikes a cheerful chord. Back to work. You tug gently at the next layer. A puff of ancient dust rises, curling like incense into the ceiling beams. It smells, how to describe it, like old paper, like a spice cupboard that's given up, like burnt almonds and mildew, with a hint of eternity. And just like that, the room is alive again. Not with empathy, of course, with anticipation. Because let's face it, there's nothing quite like peeling back the past one linen strip at a time, while a bunch of wealthy Victorians cheer you on like it's some grotesque game show, and you're the host. Congratulations. Now, take a deep breath. You're only halfway through the wrappings. And trust me, it gets weirder from here. Let's hit rewind. Before you were wrist deep in desiccated linen, before Victorian partygoers clutched their pearls at the sight of a mummified spleen, before anyone thought it appropriate to mail-order human remains across continents, there was the obsession. Not just a passing phase, not a quirky trend like mustache wax or trousers with too many buttons. No, this was full-blown cultural hysteria, a collective, deeply repressed, tea-sipping fixation on death, specifically other people's deaths, preferably ones that occurred a few millennia ago under the Egyptian sun, preferably in a sarcophagus coated in golden eye makeup and mystery. It was called Egyptomania, and no, that's not a terrible band name. It was the 19th century's most fashionable disease, one that infected artists, intellectuals, lords, ladies, schoolchildren, probably your dentist. If it had a sphinx on it, Victorians wanted it. If it was vaguely shaped like a pyramid, they'd slap it on a tea set and call it exotic. Why? Why were respectable Britons, people who wore 12 layers to bathe, suddenly plastering scarabs on their wallpaper and naming their poodles Cleopatra? Because they were bored, and rich, and imperialist. Let's be blunt. Empire is a hell of a drug. The British Empire had its starched fingers in half the globe, and Egypt, sun-drenched, ancient, and full of lootable stone, was the crown jewel of mystery. It was old, older than their churches, older than their myths, older than the concept of British, and nothing gets a Victorian more excited than the idea of something older than they are. It reminded them that they were superior, because they had found it. But Egypt wasn't just old, it was dramatic. Tombs, curses, gold coffins shaped like people. It was the full package, so naturally the Victorians romanticized the absolute hell out of it. And what better way to honor a culture than to dig it up, steal its relics, and host cocktail parties over its corpses? To understand just how weird things got, consider this. In the 1840s, wealthy Londoners threw mummy balls. Yes, balls. As in, dance floors, champagne, string quartets, and decorative mummies posed in corners like particularly judgmental coat racks. They even had themed snacks, Egypt-themed jelly molds, shaped like pyramids. You have not lived until you've watched a mustachioed banker spoon ancient Egypt out of a gelatin dessert while discussing freight tariffs. Meanwhile, writers couldn't get enough. Gothic fiction exploded with tales of reanimated mummies haunting the streets of Whitechapel, seeking vengeance for desecrated tombs. These stories were melodramatic, inaccurate, and enormously popular. Mummies became the Victorian version of zombies, only dustier, and with better cheekbones. And let's not forget the museums. Oh, the museums. Every respectable gentleman's club, prep school, or provincial display case wanted its very own piece of the ancient puzzle. Bonus points if it came with a tragic backstory or a mysterious hieroglyph no one could read. British museums began stuffing their basements with artifacts that had been, shall we say, liberated from their original homes. It didn't matter if they were misidentified, mislabeled, or just plain made up. If it looked Egyptian, it got a glass case. Even the Queen got in on it. Queen Victoria herself was reportedly intrigued by the whole Egyptian vibe, though to be fair, she was intrigued by very little, so that's saying something. But let's not kid ourselves. Egyptomania wasn't about Egypt. It was about the idea of Egypt. A romanticized, sanitized, controllable version. One you could fold into your drawing room decor and use to impress guests at Sunday tea. And, naturally, it tied into something much deeper: death. You see, Victorian England was utterly obsessed with death. Morbidly, theatrically, emotionally obsessed. They held elaborate funerals, took post-mortem photographs of dead relatives, posed like they were still alive. Yes, really. And wore mourning clothes for literal years. The line between the living and the dead wasn't so much a line as a politely blurred smudge. So when they looked at ancient Egypt, at a culture that also cared deeply about the afterlife, they saw a kindred spirit, a mirror, a culture that, like them, believed death wasn't the end, but just the beginning of something long and ritualized and extremely inconvenient for the neighbors. Only difference? The Egyptians did it with style: pyramids, canopic jars, painted masks, gold-laced coffins the size of wine cellars. Compared to that, a Victorian grave looked like a poorly decorated compost heap. No wonder they were envious. Which brings us to the dinner parties. Eventually the obsession mutated. It wasn't enough to read about pyramids. It wasn't enough to own a scarab necklace or mispronounce the word Ray at parties. No, they wanted to see it, to touch it, to open it, preferably while holding a wineglass and gossiping about Lord Sheffield's affair with his governess. Hence, mummy unwrapping parties. Because what's more exciting than seeing a real ancient body, someone who lived, breathed, and hoped for eternity, be slowly dismembered by a man named Nigel, while you nibble on cucumber sandwiches? And it wasn't just about spectacle. Unwrapping mummies gave Victorians a sense of control. Here was death, tamed, foreign death, even better, a death you could stage manage, a death you could assign meaning to. Never mind the actual person inside the wrappings. They were a vessel now, a metaphor, a centerpiece. And if that sounds a little macabre, congratulations, you are beginning to understand the Victorian soul. They needed these rituals. They needed the illusion of dominion over death, time, and mystery. Because for all their corsets and empire and polished boots, they were just as scared of the dark as the rest of us. So they lit a candle, and held a scalpel, and peeled away the past one strip of linen at a time. What does it say about a society when dinner parties revolve around dead bodies? Maybe that it's curious? Maybe that it's clever? Or maybe, just maybe, that it's a little too in love with its own reflection in the two. It starts, like many catastrophes, with paperwork. Picture this: a British customs officer at the Port of London, squinting at a shipping manifest that reads, quite plainly, 2 human remains, linen wrapped, fragile. He sips his tea, nods sagely, and stamps it, cleared for entry. No questions, no raised eyebrows, just another day in the glamorous world of importing 3,000-year-old corpses like they're crates of bananas. Welcome to the Victorian mummy trade, the world's least respectful import business. Now, this wasn't some secret underground network run by shadowy figures in cloaks. No, it was proudly out in the open. Entire shipping companies made tidy profits ferrying bodies from Cairo to Liverpool, like Amazon Prime for the dead. Travel time? Several weeks. Packaging? Minimal. Moral outrage? Non-existent. So how did this become a thing? Let's rewind to Egypt, 19th century. The country's a mess of crumbling dynasties and crumbling colonial arrangements. European powers, especially Britain and France, are poking around in every tomb, crypt and pile of sand they can find. Archaeology at this point is less science and more luxury scavenger hunt. You've got wealthy tourists with more money than sense, bumbling around with parasols and camels, pointing at the Valley of the Kings like it's an antique store. You've got hired diggers, mostly local laborers, vastly underpaid, who've learned exactly what foreigners will buy: statues, amulets, finger bones, mummified cats, and of course the full human package. It's all for sale, and business is booming. Tombs that had remained sealed for thousands of years, now pried open with crowbars and ransacked before breakfast. Entire necropolises are turned into bargain bins. There are so many mummies being discovered that locals start grinding them up into fertilizer. Yes, fertilizer. Because when you're running an empire, even the dead must be productive. But for British collectors, the real prize is the intact body. It's 7:45 p.m. The chandelier is lit. The oysters are sweating slightly on a silver tray. Somewhere in the corner, a harpist is plucking out a dainty tune while sipping gin from a teacup. The guests are arriving in waves: lace gloves, monocles, monocled gloves, the works. And you're downstairs, elbow deep in embalming residue, trying to decide whether the smell wafting off the sarcophagus is mildew, frankincense, or just something ancient you probably shouldn't be breathing in. Because tonight, you are the entertainment. Not part of the entertainment. The entertainment. You, the working class assistant with one decent coat and an allergy to social class mobility, have been hired to conduct the most fashionable spectacle of the season, the mummy unwrapping. It's not a metaphor. Tonight, you will physically remove the linen bindings from a 3,000-year-old corpse, while a room full of champagne-hazed aristocrats watches, wide-eyed and slightly hungry. And no, this isn't some weird science demo. This is leisure. This is culture. This is Victorian high society at its absolute weirdest. The room has been prepared meticulously. The mummy, tonight's guest of honor, is stretched out on a mahogany table, borrowed from the dining hall. A faint outline of where the roast used to sit still lingers. Irony, probably unintentional. On the table beside it, you've arranged your instruments: scalpels, tweezers, brushes, one disturbingly large dessert spoon, just in case. The tools gleam under candlelight, polished to theatrical perfection. A decanter of brandy glints nearby. Not for you, of course. You're just the corpse handler. No one trusts the help with good liquor. The crowd filters in, their murmurs floating like perfume. Silk rustles. A monocle falls. A feather boa sneezes into existence. Lady Paddington, smelling like violets and colonial entitlement, fans herself and whispers, "Is it fresh?" You bite your tongue. The host, a portly man who once tried to invest in a steam-powered lawnmower, and now dabbles in Egyptology because it makes him sound intellectual, at dinner, stands beside you and raises a hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the mysteries of the East." Polite applause. A child coughs. Someone says, "Is that mold?" You begin. First a little speech. Not for dramatic effect, though it has that, but because you've learned that starting cold makes the ladies scream, and the footman refuses to clean up faints anymore. You give a few lines about the significance of burial customs, the ritual importance of embalming, the depth of time between then and now. Most of it is nonsense. Something you picked up from a pamphlet and embellished with a few dramatic pauses. Then the cutting begins. The first layer is always the thickest. Linen stiff with resin, hardened like old leather. You slice, careful, but practiced. It comes away in flakes, each piece fluttering to the floor like ancient snow. The crowd leans in. Some whisper. A few grimace. One woman claps quietly, as if you've just performed a card trick. You peel. You explain. You dramatize. This section, you say, pointing with your scalpel, was likely wrapped around the torso to preserve internal organs after removal. Common in New Kingdom embalming. Someone gasps. Probably because you said internal organs. As you work your way down, the body reveals itself inch by inch. Bits of darkened flesh. Scraps of jewelry. The withered hand, curled into something almost like a wave. The face is still hidden, mercifully. That part comes later. That part always gets the loudest reaction. Around the table, the party carries on. Finger sandwiches are passed. Someone attempts a joke about unwrapping presents, which lands poorly. The harpist transitions into something vaguely ominous. One guest excuses himself to vomit in the potted fern, and yet, they can't look away. There's something hypnotic about it. Something grotesquely compelling. The peeling back of time. The exposure of secrets. Like flipping through the pages of a very sad, very dry diary, one layer at a time. You've done this before. Too many times. And still, everybody is different. Some are almost skeletal, barely held together. Others, like tonight's guest, seem almost peaceful, like they were just waiting for someone to come along and ruin their afterlife plans. A servant offers you a damp cloth. You decline. Best to keep your hands dry when you're peeling away millennia. You hit a snag, literally, a knot in the wrapping. You tug gently. It resists. The room holds its breath. You saw carefully, trying not to jostle the ribcage beneath. A bit of resin crumbles into your sleeve. You resist the urge to sneeze. Is that hair? Someone whispers. Yes. Yes, it is. Still attached. Long, braided, beautiful, in a way that makes your stomach twist a little. And here comes the face. You always save it for last. Like the final act in a grim circus. You brush away the remaining cloth, delicate now, reverent. The features beneath emerge slowly, the curve of a cheekbone, the shadow of closed eyes, lips that were once painted with crushed beetles and hope. Gasps. One woman clutches her pearls. Someone drops a canapé. Lady Paddington sways dramatically and collapses onto a chaise lounge with a soft You knew it. Every time. It's always the face. And it's always the same look. This strange mix of awe and horror and something deeper. Recognition, maybe. That this was a person. A real person. With a name and a family and dreams involving things that didn't include being paraded through a townhouse by people who think raw is a type of cheese. You step back. Let them take it in. For a brief moment, the room is silent. And then, applause. Actual. The host beams. The guests chatter. Someone asks if they can touch the hand. The harpist breaks into something suspiciously upbeat. And just like that, the moment's gone. The solemnity, the humanity, it's paper thin, folded and stored somewhere beneath the wine and the laughter. You remove your gloves. Wipe your brow. Avoid the mirror in the hallway as you leave, because you know what's coming next. Another house, another party, another corpse. But what happens when Lady Paddington faints during the exposed ribcage portion? That's tomorrow's problem. It's quiet now. The guests have gone home, carriages rolling away into the night, trailing perfume and half-eaten petit four. The drawing room is still warm with candle smoke and chatter residue, but the laughter has faded. The piano sits abandoned, one key pressed slightly down, like it's sighing. And you're still here, alone, with her, the mummy. No longer a spectacle, no longer center stage, just a body on a table, thin linen strips curling off her like fallen petals, half revealed, half forgotten. And for the first time all evening, you have a moment to think. Not speak, not perform, just. You look at the exposed parts, the contours of her ribcage, the withered hands folded neatly as if in prayer. Her face is still hidden beneath a few stubborn layers. You haven't unwrapped it yet. You told the host it was better to wait until daylight. You just didn't want to do it in front of them. There's something about the face. Always. It's the final undoing. The irreversible moment where you stop seeing a mummy and start seeing a person. You run your fingers lightly along the linen. It's brittle now, cracking along the edges. But once, this was pristine, woven, oiled, wrapped with care by people who believed this cloth could protect her through eternity. Now it's stained with wax and fingerprints, and one guest spilled claret. You feel something tighten in your chest. Not guilt. You passed guilt 5 corpses ago. It's something else. Something softer. Stranger. Almost like shame. Who was she? You'll never know. The label that came with her, scrawled in broken French, claimed daughter of a Theban noble. But that could mean anything. Could be truth. Could be marketing. More likely someone trying to boost resale value with a sprinkle of imagined nobility. But you can guess some things. She was loved. Someone wrapped her. That wasn't a quick job. Her body was prepared with care. Her amulets placed precisely. Her hands arranged just so. Whoever she was, she mattered to someone. Take a breath. That was someone's mother. The linen at her throat is knotted tight. You ease your blade underneath, sawing slowly. No audience now. No gasps. No fanfare. Just you and the sound of ancient cloth surrendering to steel. With each slice, you peel back history layer upon layer, ritual upon ritual. Every turn of the cloth was once a prayer. Every binding, a promise. And here you are, undoing them. There's something symbolic in that. Something unnerving. Like reading someone's diary and then tearing out the pages one by one. A body in layers, yes. But also a life. Folded, packed, protected, and now, dissected. You glance at her torso. Thin gold inlays glint faintly beneath the lamp. One has snapped in half. You pocket it without thinking. It's not theft. Not really. You're not paid enough for dignity. The embalming was well done. Skin like cured leather, color long gone, replaced by a waxy tan that looks artificial, until you remember, this is what time does. It doesn't rot so much as erase. Another layer comes free. More linen, more dust. You try not to inhale. One time, you coughed for 3 days, and your spit turned brown. The doctor said it was residue from antiquity. You think he meant corpse dust, but didn't want to ruin your appetite. You sit on the edge of the table, her legs beside you, stiff beneath the wrappings. You wonder what her last thoughts were. Was she afraid? Did she die young? Was she old? Did she know she'd be buried with charms and oils, only to be unearthed centuries later by men with accents and terrible taste in waistcoats? Unlikely. But that's the real horror of this job. Not the bones, not the smell, not even the eyes when they haven't fully decomposed and stare up at you like marbles. It's the stories you can't hear. All these people, preserved, prepped, prayed over, and then unwrapped like gifts no one remembers asking for, reduced to entertainment. Their history buried under linen and ego. They become props, curiosities, conversation pieces with fingernails. You peel another layer. A small amulet tumbles free. You pick it up, turquoise, shaped like a beetle, a scarab, still intact, still beautiful, probably sacred. You wonder if it meant something to her. Protection? Luck? Or just something her family could afford. You roll it between your fingers. For a moment the stone feels warm, then it's just cold again. You place it gently on her chest. Tonight was a performance, but this part, this quiet undoing, it's something else. Almost a ritual in reverse. Not sacred, but not entirely profane either. It's intimate, awkwardly so, like undressing a memory. Like being handed someone's silence and told, break this carefully. You look down at her face, still hidden. One last knot at the chin. You hesitate. Not because of fear, you're used to that now. It's something more reverent. The understanding that once you lift the final layer, there's no going back. So you wait. Let the moment breathe. Let it settle. You stand, stretch your back. The room is dim now. Just one lamp flickering. The candles have all melted into wax puddles. The harp in the corner has fallen silent. Somewhere down the hall, a clock chimes midnight. You reach for your coat, brush the dust from your hands. You'll finish in the morning. Give her one last night in peace. She's earned it. You arrive the next morning, half drenched in London drizzle, smelling faintly of coal smoke and regret. You were supposed to get a full night's rest, but dreams of linen and empty eyes kept you staring at the ceiling. Again, the mummy still on the table, right where you left her. The cloth at her jawline slightly loosened. The scarab amulet resting like a forgotten apology on her chest. It would be a tender scene if not for the sharp voices echoing down the hall. The doctors have arrived. And by doctors, of course, we mean self-proclaimed experts with wildly varying levels of training and exactly zero respect for the dead. This is Victorian London, where medicine is basically improv theatre, with a stethoscope and enough sideburns to conceal ignorance. Dr. Horace Finch is the ringleader. He's written 2 books, both unreviewed, both full of long Latin words he made up. One is titled Phrenological Implications of Ancient Skulls, and the other, On the Peculiar Smells of the Egyptian Tomb. Neither are bestsellers, but Horace has friends in high places, and an ego shaped like the Great Pyramid. Ah, the specimen, he says upon entering the room, adjusting his spectacles with theatrical flair. Still in situ, I presume? You nod, wiping your hands on your coat. He says specimen like she's a beetle pinned in a display case. Behind him shuffle 2 assistants, one very pale, the other very nervous. The pale one is probably named Cyril or Archibald. The nervous one is carrying what appears to be a sugar spoon and a notebook. Neither make eye contact with you. You're the help. You don't get eye contact. Horace approaches the body with reverence, as much reverence as a man can manage, while sniffing and muttering. Curious discoloration, possibly due to arid interment. Or perhaps embalmer's error. You resist the urge to correct him. You're not a scholar, but even you know this is standard resin darkening. You've seen it a dozen times, but Horace doesn't like being contradicted. Especially not by someone without a top hat and published theories about skull bumps. Which brings us to phrenology. Yes. That beautiful science-adjacent nonsense. In Victorian England, phrenology is all the rage. The belief that you can determine someone's intelligence, personality and moral fibre by fondling their skull. Bumps meant ambition, dents meant laziness, big foreheads, natural leaders, sloped skull, criminal tendencies. It's anthropology meets palmistry, with a dash of racism, and a sprinkle of pure fiction. Horace runs his fingers along the mummy's scalp. Well, what's left of it? Note the pronounced occipital ridge, he says, as if it means anything. Likely a labourer, or possibly a thief. You say nothing. The assistants nod vigorously and scribble. One of them nearly writes on the corpse. Next, Horace pulls out calipers, measuring cheekbones, eye sockets, the gap between molars. He clicks his tongue dramatically after each reading, like a disappointed schoolmaster marking up a bad essay. She was no noblewoman, he declares. Far too coarse. You stare at the amulet still lying on her chest, the tiny turquoise beetle. You think of the care in the wrapping, the resin, the gold thread you found at her waist, the tenderness. But sure, coarse. One assistant whispers, perhaps she was a dancer. Horace sneers, highly unlikely. The femurs are far too narrow. Dancers require robust hip structure. You mentally log this under total nonsense. Then comes the dissection. Because of course, it wouldn't be a Victorian medical examination without someone cutting open a preserved body, just to see what's inside. Horace selects a scalpel like a man choosing dessert. The assistants hold their breath. You step back. With a flourish he slices into the abdomen. Resin flakes off like ash. A dry hiss escapes, probably from trapped air or crumbling organ tissue, but the room still recoils, as if the dead just sighed. Fascinating, Horace mutters. Liver appears, compressed. Perhaps she suffered from a digestive disorder, or melancholy. You blink. Melancholy. He moves on, gesturing toward the pelvic cavity. Reproductive organs are present, he announces, with the smugness of a man who's just discovered fire. She likely bore children. You grit your teeth. This isn't science. This is divination with a scalpel. A seance by another name. Only instead of ghosts, they're conjuring theories. And instead of meaning, they're just making it up as they go. But it plays well. Horace writes everything down in a leather notebook, flipping pages with dramatic precision. The assistants photograph the remains, one using flash powder that leaves scorch marks on the table. They measure the teeth. They weigh the skull. They nod and hem and stroke their chins like philosophers. And through it all, she just lies there, stripped, cut, interpreted. Like a book they're too arrogant to learn the language of, so they just draw pictures in the margins instead. You wonder, briefly, what the mummy would think, if her spirit is watching this sad circus of self-importance, if she's screaming, or laughing, or just rolling her metaphysical eyes. The examination ends with Horace declaring, a satisfactory session. I believe we have much to publish. The assistants pack up. One leaves a biscuit on the embalming tray. You're left to clean up. As always, as you wipe down the table, you notice a scrap of paper tucked under a journal. It's a sketch diagram, her body, annotated like a blueprint. Not noble. Possible malnutrition. Occipital depression. Idleness. You crumple it in your pocket. Back outside, the fog has thickened. London coughs around you. You exhale. Medical science, they say. More like mythology in a lab coat. And yet somehow it's taken seriously. Because Horace speaks Latin. Because Horace wears gloves. Because Horace has a monocle and a mustache and calls himself doctor. And the dead, they don't get to object. You'd think at some point someone would pause and ask, hey, maybe we shouldn't burn 3,000-year-old scrolls to light the fireplace. But no, not in Victorian England. Because when it came to ancient texts, papyri, scrolls, inscriptions, our top-hatted ancestors reacted with all the delicacy of a toddler with a crayon and a priceless Rembrandt. Let's set the stage. It's the 1840s, and London is drowning in artifacts, sarcophagi in gardens, mummies in drawing rooms, and stuffed between the layers of linen wrappings, between the toes of embalmed corpses, tucked in clay jars and collapsed tombs, are papyri, thin, fragile, impossibly old scrolls of writing. Some are spells, others prayers. Some are tax records or love letters or shopping lists for temple feasts. All are priceless, which is exactly why they were so thoroughly, enthusiastically, and stupidly destroyed. See, the problem with papyrus is that it's boring, at least to Victorians. It's not shiny. It's not gold. It doesn't have a spooky face or a curse attached. It's just paper. Old, crackling paper that looks like the inside of a moth's wallet. And worse, it's in a language that barely anyone can read. Egyptian hieratic, Demotic script, Coptic, that's just scribbles to most British collectors. So when some poor mummy is unwrapped and a scroll falls out of her chest cavity, the average reaction goes something like this. Oh look, another one of those dusty old letters. Smells like mildew. Toss it in the grate, will you? No, really. They burn them. Papyri, actual, historical, irreplaceable written records, were used as kindling, used to start fires, light cigars, or simply tossed in the bin. Some were shredded for packing material. Others were given to children as drawing paper. One nobleman reportedly used strips of papyrus as bookmarks for his Shakespeare collection, because irony is eternal. And then there's the eating. Yes, eating. Some believed that the blackened, resin-covered scrolls contained mystical properties. If ground up and mixed with honey or wine, they might boost memory, cure headaches, enhance dreams. It's unclear who started this idea, but by the mid-19th century, there were documented cases of people consuming papyrus like it was medicine, or a very bad sandwich. So what exactly was lost? Everything. Imagine this. You're a priest in Thebes, writing down the ritual order for a funeral procession. You've inked every syllable carefully, pauses, chants, the placement of sacred oils on scrolls you've baked in the sun and sealed in a jar. You bury it with the body, confident that the gods will receive your words and guide the dead safely to the afterlife. Then, 2,000 years later, some guy named Reginald from Surrey uses your work to light a cigar. Let that sink in. Entire temples worth of writing gone. Early medical practices, histories of minor dynasties, folk tales, songs, legal documents, all erased, because they didn't sparkle enough. And here's the real kicker. Even when Victorians wanted to preserve the papyri, they often made things worse. They'd coat the scrolls in shellac to protect them, which, naturally, made them unreadable. Or they'd try to unfold brittle pages with damp hands and brute force. Picture trying to open a pop-up book made of eggshells. In one infamous case, a curator attempted to iron a scroll flat with an actual iron on full heat. The result? Papyrus flambe. Even the best-intentioned scholars struggled. Translation was difficult, thanks to wildly inconsistent hieroglyph charts and a general sense of academic egoism. Everyone wanted to be the one to crack the code, which meant sharing notes was rare and sabotaging rivals was practically sport. You know what wasn't rare? Misinterpretation. One papyrus containing a list of temple offerings was translated, with great confidence, as an ancient weather forecast. Another detailing grain rations was assumed to be a love poem, romantic, if you like, metaphors involving barley. And all of this chaos was driven by the same ugly force behind the mummy trade. Colonial curiosity without accountability. To the British public, Egypt was a treasure chest. A dusty, mysterious theme park full of wonders to be mined, misused, and mounted on walls. Nobody cared that these scrolls belonged to a civilization with living descendants, a culture that might have appreciated the chance to read its own history. They just wanted trophies. The papyrus panic peaked around the 1850s. Collectors scrambled for anything with markings. Dealers forged entire documents by copying random squiggles and staining the pages with tea. Museums were flooded with fakes and didn't care, so long as it looked impressive. One curator famously did scroll upside down for 6 years before anyone noticed. By the time Egyptologists began advocating for real preservation, labeling, storing, translating properly, It was too late for many of the oldest finds. Tombs had been stripped, scrolls incinerated, knowledge, literal, ancient knowledge turned into ash and footnotes. You pause. You're back in the drawing room now, sweeping up what's left of last night's unwrapping, bits of linen, an amulet, and tucked beneath the table, a crumpled scrap of papyrus. The ink has faded. The script is delicate. Your fingers tremble. You don't know what it says. It could be a prayer. It could be the only surviving record of a family's name. Or it could just be a note about goat taxes. Either way, it matters. You place it in your coat pocket, gently. Maybe it's too late to undo the stupidity. But maybe, just maybe, it's not too late to stop it from getting worse. Because some stories don't deserve to be smoke. They deserve to be read. Let's say you've got a headache. The year is 1847. The sky is grey. Your doctor smells like gin and formaldehyde. And he's just returned from a medical conference where someone presented a cure for gout that involved leeches, chalk dust, and whistling at the moon. So naturally, his prescription for you is this: grind up a mummy and snort it. Not metaphorically, literally. Welcome to the dazzlingly deranged world of mumia, the hottest medicinal fad in Victorian Britain, and possibly the most stomach-churning chapter in the long history of very bad ideas, disguised as medicine. It starts innocently enough, somewhere back in medieval Europe. Some enterprising physician noticed that mummies, yes, actual human mummies, contained bitumen, that sticky black substance used in embalming. Bitumen was believed to have healing properties, so someone got the brilliant idea to scrape it off, preserved corpses, grind the whole mess into powder, and sell it in jars. Fast forward to the 19th century, and the British took this ancient practice and cranked it up to 11.
Need an aphrodisiac? Mumia.
Suffering from a cold? Mumia. Want to look youthful and refined at dinner parties? Put a pinch of powdered farro on your tongue and smile through the taste of death and cinnamon. Apothecaries sold it in little glass vials with fancy labels. Egyptian earth, noble dust, the king's remedy. It was marketed as exotic, powerful, and curiously delicious with a splash of wine. And because it was expensive, it became a status symbol. If you could afford to ingest an actual ancient person for your health, you were clearly someone worth inviting to the opera. What did it taste like? According to one record, a mixture of peat, cloves and misery. But no one cared, because Victorians believed in the power of decay. They were fascinated by death, decay, and everything morbidly adjacent. If it was mouldy, brittle, or vaguely cursed, they wanted to eat it, rub it on their skin, or hang it above their mantle. And so, mummies were ground into oblivion by the ton. Literally. There are accounts of entire workshops set up to pulverize the bodies imported from Egypt. Corpses were unwrapped, stripped, chopped, baked and milled like flour. The resulting powder was sold to doctors, barbers, painters, yes, some used it as pigment, and the elite, who genuinely believed that consuming the dead made you stronger, smarter, and sexier. You can't make this up. One chemist's shop in Soho reportedly displayed a full mummy in the window as advertising. Come in for your weekly ration of ancient royalty. Just beneath the display was a sign that read, fortifies the blood, sharpens the mind, enlivens the soul. Sure. Nothing says soul enlivening like sipping on powdered spleen. Even worse, it wasn't just taken internally. People started wearing it. There are documented recipes for mumia facial balm, a sort of night cream designed to tighten the skin and imbue one with ancient vitality. Ingredients included beeswax, rose oil, and you guessed it, a sprinkling of finely ground embalmed Egyptian. This wasn't fringe science, this was mainstream. Doctors' actual, titled, bow-tie-wearing doctors prescribed it. Socialites endorsed it. Clergymen didn't object. Museums quietly donated the bodies of less interesting mummies to apothecaries under the table. It was the wellness industry before Instagram. A snake oil era with actual snakes and people. Now, you might be thinking, surely someone objected. Surely someone said, hey, maybe eating the dead for fun and profit is crossing a line. And yes. Eventually, someone did. Sort of. By the late 1800s, actual Egyptologists, those rare few trying to treat ancient culture with respect, began raising concerns, not just about the ethics of it, but about the accuracy, because as it turns out, much of what was being sold as mumia wasn't even Egyptian. It was just any corpse. sometimes dried criminals, sometimes plague victims, sometimes freshly dead poor people, stolen from graves and passed off as antiquities. As long as it was dry and vaguely dusty, it would do. Which means that all those aristocrats thinking they were imbibing the essence of Ramses were probably just chewing on Jeff from Leeds. Poetic justice, really. And what did Mumia actually do? Absolutely nothing. Best case, it added some fiber to your diet. Worst case, it gave you dysentery, lead poisoning, or an intimate encounter with long-dead bacteria. The real result was the wholesale desecration of Egypt's history, repackaged as holistic self-care. It wasn't just consumption, it was cannibalism, with a monocle. Imagine the scene. A gentleman in a silk cravat, seated beside a roaring fireplace, stirring a spoonful of ancient powdered human into his port. He toasts to good health. Somewhere in the distance, a sarcophagus weeps. And you? You're standing in the corner of a drawing room, watching someone do exactly that. The host, fresh off last week's unwrapping party, is showing off his newest acquisition, a jar labelled Mumia, 100% authentic. He scoops some onto a cracker, spreads it with mustard, and offers it to a guest, who giggles and says, "Only if it pairs well with the claret." You stifle the urge to scream. They pass the jar around, laughing. You wonder which part of the body it came from. You wonder if the person it belonged to had a name, a child, a job. You wonder if they ever dreamed of immortality, and whether this is what they meant. You look down at your hands. They still smell like embalming resin. You feel the dust in your lungs. You excuse yourself. Outside, the fog clings to the gas lamps. You walk slowly, the jar's image still flickering in your mind. There are lines, you think. But in this city, they're always drawn in chalk, and chalk washes away. It's amazing what you can sneak past customs when it's already dead. Victorian Britain was many things. Industrial, imperial, impressively obsessed with mustache grooming, but subtle, not exactly. And yet, when it came to importing human remains, the British elite became master smugglers with powdered wigs and impeccable handwriting. Welcome to the charmingly grotesque world of mummy smuggling, a bureaucratic ballet of loopholes, bribes, mislabeled crates, and officials who are either willfully blind or just too polite to ask questions like, "Why does this package of linen goods smell like embalming resin and regret?" Let's start at the docks. A cargo ship from Alexandria slides into port, hull creaking under the weight of spice jars, cotton bales, and one distinctly coffin-shaped crate marked "Antique Furnishings, Fragile." Inside, one very real, very ancient human being, nestled between straw padding and a forged invoice that reads "Statuary item." The customs officer glances at it, shrugs, and stamps it. No questions, no inspection, because here's the trick. Dead people didn't count. Legally, there were no established protocols for the importation of human remains, unless they were for burial or still technically alive. Everything else, grey area, and grey areas, as any aristocrat will tell you, are ideal for doing shady things while looking incredibly respectable. It didn't stop at full bodies. Body parts were easier. A foot here, a hand there, bits of jawbone wrapped in muslin and tucked into the bottom of a trunk. One collector reportedly stuffed an entire mummy's skull into a teapot for safe travel. Another crammed an assortment of ribs into a violin case. The customs form ornamental souvenirs. You can't make this up. Then there were the museums. Oh, the museums. By the 1860s, every mid-sized town with a town hall and a mildly curious vicar wanted a mummy. But shipping whole corpses was expensive and complicated, especially when too many ended up damaged, mouldy, or embarrassingly pungent. So curators got creative. One strategy involved declaring the bodies as archaeological samples. Another, botanical specimens, on account of the linen being made of flax. A bit of a stretch, perhaps, but that's never stopped anyone with a powdered wig and a Latin degree. Smuggling was so common it became routine. One shipping clerk reportedly asked, "Full mummy or just parts?" the way you'd ask about tea or coffee. And behind every dodgy shipment, there was a gentleman with a monocle and a vague job title: collector, scholar, gentleman explorer. These were men who'd returned from Egypt with trunks full of bones, calling themselves historians, while they stored finger bones in cigar boxes and hosted dinner parties where guests could hold someone's shin. There's one story, probably apocryphal, but too good to ignore, about a lord who imported a full mummy under the name Horace, claimed he was a servant, dressed him up in a hat and coat, sat him upright in a carriage, and waved at passers-by all the way from the dock to his estate. No one blinked. Why? Because the class system is a hell of a disguise. But what happens when you don't have an estate? Let's meet Albert. Albert is a porter, a short, tired man with bad knees and a sharp eye for crates. He works at a warehouse in Wapping and has handled everything from barrels of pickled herring to stacks of stolen books. One day a wooden crate arrives, unlabeled, no paperwork, just a smudge of red wax on the lid. Albert's job is to move it. He doesn't ask questions until the crate leaks. First, it's just a smell, sweet and sour, like dried fruit and formaldehyde. Then, the lid warps from dampness. Then something inside shifts. Albert opens it. Inside, a torso, wrapped in linen, missing limbs, still faintly marked with hieroglyphs. No head, no label, no explanation. Albert panics, tries to call his supervisor, finds out the man left for Brighton yesterday and won't be back for weeks. The crate technically doesn't exist, which means the torso is now Albert's responsibility. He does what any overworked Victorian labourer would do, drags it home. He lives in a narrow flat over a bakery. The landlady is deaf, thank God. He hides the torso under his bed. Every night, he stares at the ceiling and wonders if this is how ghosts happen. After 3 days of silence, he writes a letter to the Royal Museum. No reply. He tries a private collector. They offer 5 shillings and a ham. Albert declines. He buries the torso in the garden behind the bakery, beneath a patch of overgrown mint. To this day, no one has dug it up. That's how casually history was handled. How carelessly it was passed, shipped, mislabeled, and forgotten. For every mummy put on display behind glass, 10 more were boxed, botched, or buried in places they were never meant to be. And through it all, the bureaucracy remained blissfully uninvolved. Because asking too many questions about corpses makes you seem unpatriotic. Or worse, French. So the shipments continued. Crates came and went, bones crossed borders, and the dead were scattered like artifacts of inconvenience, disassembled, repurposed, swallowed by the fog of paperwork and soot. You think back to the woman on the table. Her body shipped in a crate marked antique drapery. Her soul declared non-essential. And somewhere in a museum drawer sits her hand. In another, her amulet. In someone's private library, her skull, propped beside a globe. All labelled, catalogued, displayed, but never reunited. Because bureaucracy loves control, but it hates responsibility. And what's more convenient than a body that can't file complaints? It starts with a headline. Death follows unwrapping. Society host falls dead days after ancient ceremony. Below it, a grainy sketch of a sarcophagus. Then a subheading, a mummy's wrath from beyond the grave. And just like that, the Victorians fall in love all over again. Because if there's one thing British society loves more than desecrating ancient remains, it's assigning supernatural consequences when things get slightly inconvenient. Enter the mummy's curse. Let's be clear, this wasn't a real belief. Not at first. There was no sacred inscription threatening doom. No scarab with a vendetta. No ancient priest mumbling hexes from the underworld. The ancient Egyptians, meticulous as they were, didn't really go in for horror movie theatrics. Their afterlife was bureaucratic, not bloody. But facts have never stood a chance against a good story. And Victorian newspapers? They knew how to tell a very good story. It begins with coincidences. A collector dies suddenly after receiving a mummy. A photographer develops spots on his hands after documenting an unwrapping. A museum assistant falls down a flight of stairs 3 days after cataloguing a particularly angry-looking mummy. Coincidence? Absolutely. But to a public already neck-deep in seances, tarot cards, and afternoon hauntings, these stories are fuel. And the press? They throw on the gasoline. Within months, the mummy's curse becomes legend. Rumours spiral. Every minor mishap, near a sarcophagus, is now part of an ancient revenge plot. Newspapers write breathless accounts of unexplainable accidents and ghostly whispers heard near crates of relics. One particularly dramatic article describes a mummy's wrappings catching fire on their own, which probably had more to do with a careless candle than a deathly hex. But that's beside the point. Fear sells, especially when it's neatly wrapped in linen and draped in colonial gilt. The British, it seems, needed the curse. Not because they believed in it, really, but because they wanted to. Deep down, they knew. knew that something wasn't quite right about ripping the dead from their graves and shipping them across the sea like party decorations. The curse was a way to feel the weight of that wrongdoing without ever having to admit it. "Oh, we shouldn't have done that," they'd whisper. Then immediately plan another unwrapping party. It's a form of narrative insurance. You profit off the dead, but if bad things happen, well, it's the mummy's fault, not yours. Blame the curse, blame the gods, blame anything but yourself. And the stories only get more elaborate. One tale tells of a museum guard who goes mad after spending a night alone in the Egyptian wing. Another recounts a wealthy dowager who begins speaking in unknown tongues after touching a mummy's amulet. Read she had a stroke, and of course there's the classic. Everyone who attended the unwrapping died within a year, which conveniently ignores that most of those people were already in their 70s and had a 2-cigar-a-day habit. But the details don't matter. The myth is what counts. Soon, fiction writers get involved. Theatre's debut plays titled The Wrath of the Pharaoh and The Curse of the Black Sarcophagus. Penny dreadfuls feature resurrected mummies stalking foggy London streets, exacting revenge on those who disturbed their rest. The mummy becomes a new kind of monster, slower than Dracula, dustier than Frankenstein, but just as unsettling. It wasn't about history anymore. It was about drama. And Hollywood? Decades later, it would feast on the leftovers. Boris Karloff's 1932 portrayal of Imhotep, the cursed priest turned vengeful corpse, cements the image linen-wrapped horror, eyes glowing with ancient fury, dragging one foot at a time toward poetic justice. But back in Victorian London, the curse was more than fiction. It was a brand. Collectors began whispering about it at parties. "This one's cursed," they'd say, tapping a sarcophagus with mock fear. 3 accidents since Tuesday. And suddenly, the item's value would go up, because nothing attracts the rich like a little danger, or at least the illusion of it. Even museums leaned in. One displayed a coffin with a plaque that read, "Believed to bring misfortune to those who sleep nearby." That same museum had poor ventilation and lead pipes, but again, blame the mummy. Meanwhile, actual Egyptologists rolled their eyes so hard they nearly went blind. They were trying to study burial practices, cultural rituals, hieroglyphics, and here comes the general public, convinced the papyrus scrolls contain death spells and secret plagues. One archaeologist wrote in a private letter, "I can hardly show a child a coffin lid without their mother clutching them as if it will swallow them whole." And yet the myth persisted, because it was easier to believe in ghosts than to face history, easier to fear the curse than to ask, should we have stolen this? And honestly, it made for better dinner conversation. Did I ever tell you about the cursed hand I keep in my library? No one's ever touched it and lived. Really? How tragic. Pass the claret. You're at one of those dinners now. Listening. A gentleman is recounting how his uncle once tripped over a mummified foot in Cairo and developed chronic indigestion. He blames it on an ancient spell. You resist the urge to explain how digestion works. Instead, you excuse yourself and walk out into the fog. You think about the mummy you unwrapped 2 weeks ago, her amulet still in your pocket, her eyes closed forever, never got to see the land she was taken to, but maybe that's for the best, because here, her story's been rewritten. No longer priestess, mother, daughter, now just cursed, a fiction to sell papers, a superstition to spice up guilt, but she deserved more than that. They all did. You light a cigarette, watch the smoke curl skyward. Nothing sells like a haunted corpse, but not everything should be sold. Let's strip away the myths, the headlines, the dinner parties, the powdered jars of medicinal ribcage. Let's pause for just a moment and remember the obvious thing everyone so artfully forgot. These were people, not exhibits, not props, not cautionary tales with a spooky label, but real, breathing, once laughing human beings. And now, disassembled, displayed, dismissed. The irony, of course, is that the ancient Egyptians believed in memory, in names, in being remembered, truly remembered, as the only path to immortality. To speak the name of the dead was to give them breath. To forget was to kill them twice. So here's a little breath. Let's meet Tia. She lived around 130 A. We know her name because it was painted carefully on the inside of her coffin, gold leaf over faded red lacquer, just below a prayer to Osiris. Her tomb wasn't grand, She wasn't a queen or a priestess. She was probably a textile worker, judging by the tools buried beside her. Spindles, needles, a scrap of dyed linen folded neatly as if she might still need it. She died in her 30s. And then she was forgotten. Until someone cracked open her tomb 3,000 years later and stuffed her coffin in the back of a shipping crate. Tia ended up in a London museum, her name mistranslated, and eventually dropped altogether from the display card. Female mummy, Theban region, estimated 18th dynasty. She became a footnote in her own story. And she's not alone. There's also Iput. Her coffin was looted during a French expedition and sold to a British nobleman who wanted a conversation piece for his hunting lodge. She was 13 when she died. The note found inside her wrappings, what some now call the world's oldest love letter, was torn and tossed aside. Then there's Nesbiad Degiat, a scribe, male, late 25th dynasty. He once wrote legal texts for a temple in Heliopolis. His handwriting was described in a funerary inscription as elegant and precise. The parchment scroll buried with him, containing a prayer he likely copied by hand, was used by a London collector to demonstrate how ancient inks dissolve when licked. Yes, lick. You try not to scream, because you've touched these people with your own hands, peeled their linen, brushed resin from their bones. You've seen the little details, the amulets, the traces of makeup, the faint lines etched into once calloused hands. You've stood over them in silence. You've listened to the room hold its breath when their faces were revealed. And every time, the same thought. They had lives. Not in the vague historical sense. In the personal one. They got cold. They got sick. They argued. They danced. They prayed. They worried about food, about children, about whether the flooding of the Nile would be good this year. They loved. And for that, just for being human, they were unwrapped and reduced to spectacle. Turned into riddles, entertainment, nightmares. No one remembered their names. No one asked. Victorian London treated them like relics. But relics are things, and these weren't things. They were stories. Specific ones. Lost ones. There's an ache in that. A mourning. Not just for the bodies, but for the silence that swallowed them. The loss isn't just physical. It's narrative. It's cultural. It's human. And the most devastating part? It was avoidable. Because even if the British hadn't understood the languages, hadn't cracked the codes, hadn't been able to pronounce the names, they could have cared. They could have looked at the face of a preserved girl and said, maybe this isn't a party trick. They didn't. Instead, they made assumptions. Drew lines. This one was likely a servant, said one amateur anatomist, examining pelvic width. This one, perhaps a thief, another surmised, poking at a cracked tooth. They assigned criminality to bone, built whole biographies out of nothing but guesswork and hubris. And they did it with confidence. Because it's easier to assign roles than to ask questions. Easier to invent than to investigate. And infinitely easier to believe someone less civilized didn't mind being turned into an exhibit. But imagine your own funeral, used for a party 3,000 years from now. Imagine a stranger peeling back your skin while a crowd eats hors d'oeuvres and laughs. Imagine your name being erased. Your possessions scattered, your life summarized on a small plaque, with 3 misspellings and a date range that may or may not include your birth. It wouldn't feel like honor. It would feel like theft. You sit with that for a moment, breathe it in, dust and all, because the truth is, memory matters. That's what the Egyptians believed. That's what the wrappings were for. The amulets, the carvings, the sacred texts. They weren't ornaments. They were anchors. Tools to keep the person from drifting into oblivion. But we didn't read them. We just cut them open. And in doing so, we lost not just information but dignity. You once found a fragment of papyrus buried near a woman's hip. The writing, barely visible, turned out to be a list of household items. Oil, flour, reeds for the fire, a shopping list. Mundane, simple. And in that moment she became real. Not a mummy, a woman. Maybe her name was Henu. Maybe she had a favorite song. Maybe she hated early mornings and loved figs and told stories to her children before bed. Maybe her greatest hope was to be remembered. So here's her memory. Here's their breath. You whisper it to yourself. Names, fragments, dates, the things the cards never list, the things the exhibitions ignore. You whisper, and hope it's enough. Hope? Maybe that someone might do the same for you. It didn't end with a scandal. There was no dramatic trial, no final mummy party that went so horrifyingly wrong it changed public opinion overnight. No burning effigy of a British nobleman caught stuffing embalmed limbs into his umbrella stand. It ended slowly, quietly, like a candle flickering out. Unwrapping parties, once the height of elite fashion, began to feel awkward. Not because people had a sudden burst of conscience, mind you, but because they got bored. Turns out, even aristocrats have a limit when it comes to gazing at shriveled spleens while balancing a glass of sherry. By the 1880s, the trend was limping along like a bandaged foot. The novelty wore off. The wine got stale. And let's be honest, there are only so many dried-out toe bones you can gawk at before it starts feeling less like adventure and more like a poorly lit autopsy. And then museums stepped in. Not because they were paragons of virtue, but because they saw an opportunity. You see, the public still wanted to see mummies. They just didn't want to watch them being peeled like oversized onions at private parties. They wanted polished marble halls, velvet ropes, tasteful placards with incorrect dates. They wanted respectable death. So the museum said, "We've got you." Collections began to grow rapidly. Not carefully, not ethically, but visibly. The British Museum, the Louvre, Berlin's Neues Museum, they all filled their halls with Egyptian remains. Not just mummies, coffins, canopic jars, shabti figurines, beads, jewelry, entire tombs dismantled and reassembled for the convenience of European foot traffic. And yet this was progress, sort of. Instead of having their wrappings shredded in front of drunk dinner guests, mummies were now laid in glass boxes, observed, catalogued, misnamed of course, but no longer desecrated with scalpels at random. The era of entertainment gave way to the era of enlightenment. At least, that's how the brochures framed it. In reality, it was a pivot, a rebrand. Instead of parties, the mummy became an exhibit. Still silent, still displaced, still without consent, but now she had a spotlight. Scholars began to show real interest. The kind that didn't involve burning papyri to warm their feet. Actual Egyptologists, some even with degrees, started asking different questions. They studied burial rites, preservation methods, language, diet, even hairstyles. The mummy was no longer a curiosity. She was a subject, still objectified, yes, but slowly, painfully more humanized. In 1891, a pivotal moment, the unwrapping of a priest named Nesman, was conducted in a university setting. Scientific instruments, documentation, a lecture hall of students taking notes, not sipping wine. For the first time, the event was about learning, not spectacle. People began to notice the difference. Soon after, laws were proposed, weak, vaguely worded laws, but laws nonetheless, limiting the trade of human remains. Egypt, under pressure and colonized within an inch of its soul, began to protest the export of artifacts. It was ignored, mostly, but it was the start of something. The slow pivot from plundering to preserving. Of course, museums still acquired mummies, often dubiously. Smuggling didn't stop, it just got quieter. Crates still arrived marked as art supplies or botanical samples. But now, the bodies were being studied instead of unwrapped, photographed instead of picked apart, displayed with a thin veil of reverence, usually next to a display card with a name like female 25-35 years Upper Egypt, still anonymous, still flattened into data, but not dissected on dining tables. Small victories perhaps. Pathetically small, but real. By the early 20th century, mummy unwrapping was considered gauche, outdated, the pastime of a less civilized generation, which is hilarious, because the same families who once passed mummy powder around the dinner table now lectured on archaeological ethics like they'd always known better. Hypocrisy ages well, apparently. Still, change did come. The term mummy itself began to feel clinical, impersonal. Scholars pushed for ancient Egyptian remains, for context, for dignity. Exhibits evolved, displays were adjusted. Some museums, fewer than you'd hope, began including information about the person's life, their culture, their likely name. Some even added curtains around the bodies, so visitors could choose whether to view them. Too little? Too late? Absolutely. But late is better than never. And maybe, just maybe, that shift matters. You walk through one of these museums now. The marble is cool beneath your boots. The hall smells faintly of polish and dust. Children chatter nearby, pointing at sarcophagi with wide eyes. Tourists snap photos. Somewhere, a guide is explaining mummification with the enthusiasm of someone who once auditioned for a cooking show. And there she is, behind the glass. You recognize the binding technique, the resin patterns, the faded eye paint. She's been here for decades. Labeled as unknown female, 19th dynasty. No name, but someone added a line to the display card last year. This person was likely a member of a temple household. She was preserved for eternity. Her story is still being uncovered. You linger. That line, still being uncovered, sticks with you. Because it's true. The shift from unwrapping to remembering didn't fix everything. It didn't return her home. It didn't resurrect the prayers etched into her coffin. But it began something. A slow, painful, imperfect reckoning. A moment of pause. A flicker of empathy. Centuries overdue. And so, you walk away, not with closure, but with a little more care, a little more quiet, a little more resolve that maybe, just maybe, history doesn't have to mean harm. It took centuries, but eventually, finally, the world started asking the one question Victorians never bothered with. Should we send them back? Because somewhere between the souvenir hunting of the 1800s and the sterile museum plaques of the 1900s, the descendants of the mummified dead found their voice, and they were not amused. Modern Egyptology. Real Egyptology. Not the top-hatted variety that used mummies as cocktail hour conversation starters had arrived. And it came not from drawing rooms in London, but from the streets of Cairo, Luxor, and Aswan, from universities filled with Egyptian scholars, from archaeologists who spoke the language, knew the land, and refused to treat their ancestors like travel-sized relics. The reckoning wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was insistent. Where were the bodies? Why were they in Glasgow? Why were they in storage basements beneath art galleries in New York, boxed in with broken Greco-Roman busts and mislabeled pottery shards? Why had a people's sacred dead been reduced to medical curiosities and hallway decoration? And why, after decades of talking about preservation and education and public interest, was there still no serious effort to return what had been stolen? To their credit, some institutions blinked. Some museums, uneasily, awkwardly, began the process of repatriation. It was slow, painfully slow. But mummies began to go home. In 2002, Switzerland returned a 2,600-year-old mummy named Shepanese to Egypt, following a formal request and mounting public pressure. In 2011, Germany returned fragments of a mummy's cartonnage, the painted casing that once cradled her in death, after it was discovered to have been acquired through dubious channels. The paperwork was intense. The politics were delicate, but the symbolism was enormous. Every body that returned said something louder than any museum catalogue ever had. They belonged to someone else. Still, plenty of institutions resisted. Some argued that repatriation would deprive the public of education. Others insisted the remains were safer in Europe, that they had no surviving descendants, that they'd become part of global heritage, which, let's be honest, is code for, they're ours now, and we're not giving them back. But the pushback didn't stop, because modern Egyptologists knew the truth. This wasn't about safety. It was about ownership. It was about dignity. It was about giving names back to the nameless, giving stories back to the silenced, giving control of the dead back to the living culture they came from. And it wasn't just about returning mummies. It was about how we study them. The field of Egyptology, once a European echo chamber of pyramid theories and linen fetishes, has shifted dramatically. Egyptian scholars now lead excavations. They publish their own histories. They call out inaccuracies. They demand context. You no longer need to be named Reginald and wear suspenders to study the Book of the Dead. You can be named Fatima, or Mahmud, or Armani, and you should be. The stories belong to everyone, but the bodies belong to someone. Let that sit for a second. Still watching? Then you know what to do. Support history that honors the dead. Support research that doesn't treat ancestors like display models. Support a future where cultural stewardship isn't just a PR campaign. Because here's the quiet truth most museums are only now learning. Respect is good for education. Turns out, people learn more when they aren't morally revolted. Tourists appreciate context. Students engage deeper when the narrative includes real names. Even the glass display hits differently when it's framed not as artifact 214, but as Neskonsu, who loved lotus flowers and worked in a temple near Karnak. Suddenly, she's not a thing. She's someone. Some museums now include videos from modern Egyptians in their exhibits. Spoken reflections, prayers, songs, descendants reaching across millennia to say, "We remember you. We're still here." Some have added digital reconstructions, faces restored, voices simulated, bodies not unwrapped but preserved through imaging. Non-invasive scans reveal secrets once pried from corpses with kitchen knives. Teeth, bones, posture, illness, learned without destruction, because we can now study without slicing. Technology has given us a second chance. One British university recently performed a full-body CT scan on a child mummy, without ever opening the wrappings. They discovered she was about 6 years old, malnourished, likely died from an infection. They also found that her family had placed a carved lion beside her, a toy, maybe her favorite. They left it there. No dissection, no display, just a report. And a name. Her name was Mutamine. And finally she was treated like someone who mattered. That's the new Egyptology. Less spectacle, more storytelling. Less exploitation, more empathy. And for someone like you, someone who's unwrapped more bodies than you care to count, it hits differently now. You remember the faces, the weight, the way some bones creaked as they were disturbed. You remember the silence in the room when the last layer came away and the dead stared back, not with rage but with resignation. You remember thinking, they deserved more than this. And now they're starting to get it. Not everywhere, not fast enough, but here and there, a tomb is left closed. A body is returned. A display is redesigned to say not just what a person was, but who they were. And maybe, after all this time, that's what reckoning looks like. Not fire and fury, but quiet restoration. A name returned. A soul remembered. A future unwrapped carefully. This time, you're back where you started, standing in the corner of a drawing room that smells like lilacs and formaldehyde, watching rich people pretend they're scientists. The mummy lies on the table. Her head is tilted slightly to the left, mouth open in what could be a scream or just centuries of gravity. Her fingers, still curled around nothing, are twitching in your imagination. Or maybe you haven't slept properly in a week. Hard to tell. You're the assistant. The cutter. The one with the gloves no one else bothers to wear. You've done this enough times that the pattern is second nature. Warm up the crowd with a joke, snip the linen near the neck, peel downward like you're unwrapping a centuries-old Christmas ham. Only this time it feels different. Maybe it's because you know more now. Maybe it's because she looks too human. Or maybe it's just the candlelight casting her cheekbones in a way that makes her seem like she might wake up and say something. You try not to think about that. Lord Henley is blathering on about the fascinating intersection of theology and preservation, while Lady Maud fans herself dramatically near the curtains. Someone drops a canapé. Someone else gasps as the wrappings loosen. And you keep cutting. The fabric peels away like old parchment. The scent hits your nose. Resin, dust, the faint whiff of death that refuses to fully fade no matter how many lavender sachets Lady Henley sticks in the room. You're almost at the sternum. And then, someone claps. You blink. They're applauding. For you. Like this is a magic show. Like you've pulled a rabbit from a hat, instead of peeling open a coffin to reveal the desiccated remains of a woman who never asked for this. You stare down at her ribcage. She was young. Maybe 20. Maybe younger. Her bones are thin, brittle. You can see the place where her breastplate was cracked. Accident or illness. It's impossible to say, but you say nothing. Just nod politely and continue. Lord Henley leans in and points with the tip of a quill. Note the preservation of the thoracic cavity, he announces, as though he's ever taken a scalpel to anything more complex than a roast. You wipe your hands on a cloth. You want to scream. Instead, you step back and let the rest of the room lean in, peering, whispering, making educated guesses about cause of death and social status as though her life can be reverse-engineered from bone fragments. Someone asks if she was a queen. You know better. She wasn't rich. The linen isn't fine enough. The amulets are sparse. She had a small scar on her right thigh, knife wound perhaps. She had a chipped molar too. That's what you noticed first. But none of that matters to them. They're not here for truth. They're here for spectacle. You reach for the final wrapping, just one layer left, across her face. You hesitate. No one notices. They're too busy sipping brandy and speculating about brain extraction. You look down again. Her features are faint, but still there. A soft curve to the nose. A slight overbite. Traces of black coal at the corners of her eyes. She was someone, and you're the one tearing her open. Slowly, you finish the job. The linen falls away. Her face is fully exposed now, and the room falls into a hush. Lady Maud clutches her pearls. Lord Henley murmurs something about remarkable bone symmetry. You step back again, but this time, you don't look at them. You look at her. Because you're tired. Because your hands hurt. Because somewhere along the way this stopped being interesting and started feeling wrong. You were a butcher in a borrowed coat, doing the work no one else had the stomach for, and now the room applauds again. You want to vanish. Instead, you bow. Politely. Mechanically. The way you've been trained to. And as the guests begin drifting away, some to the tea room, some to the piano, you start cleaning up. You fold the cloth. You set down the scalpel. You wipe resin from the table, and try not to notice the flecks of bone that stick to your sleeve. And when the room is finally empty, you sit down beside her. Just you, the bones, and the silence. You look at her again. She's still. Peaceful. Maybe. Or simply empty. You whisper something. Not quite an apology. Not quite a prayer. Just a sound. A reminder that someone noticed. Because this is the part no one sees. The aftermath. The quiet. The ache. The part where the unwrapping is over. And you're left with a body and a question. Was it worth it? You tell yourself it was just a job. That you needed the coin. That if you hadn't done it, someone else would have. But the truth is, none of that feels like enough anymore.
She had a name.
You never learned it. You light one final candle before leaving. Just a small one. Set it on the table beside her. It flickers once, twice, then settles into a soft glow. You leave the door open when you go, just in case. The party's over. The last carriage has rattled down the cobblestones. The laughter has dissolved into the cold London fog, leaving you alone with your thoughts and the faint, stubborn smell of embalming resin still clinging to your gloves. You step out into the street, coat pulled tight against the chill, and try to shake the images from your mind, but they cling like cobwebs. The brittle linen, the dull gaze of those empty eye sockets, the way the muscles didn't quite move as you peeled back the final layers. You wonder how many times you can do this before the dead stop being just bodies, and start to haunt your waking hours. Some nights, you dream of them, not in nightmares, at least not always. Sometimes it's quieter, a slow unfolding, a gentle whisper of cloth against skin that's no longer there, faces shifting in the shadows of your mind, names you never knew, lives you touched only in destruction. You wake up gasping, heart pounding, hands trembling as if you've been holding a scalpel all night. Your friends notice. They ask if you're ill. You lie. Say it's the damp, the coal dust, the London gloom. But it's not. It's something heavier, something that settles in your bones and refuses to leave. You start drinking more, not because you enjoy it, because it dulls the edges, mutes the ghosts, blurs the memory of peeling away someone's eternity like a bad bandage. You visit the pubs less. The laughter feels too loud, the conversation too shallow. The scent of pipe smoke mingling with stale beer reminds you of the embalming fluids, and you don't want to smell that again. You keep the job because it pays. Because there's no other work. Because no one else wants it. You're the unwrapping man. The one who peels the past. Like an onion. Nobody asked to see. Physically, the work takes a toll. Your hands crack and bleed from handling dried resin and sharp blades. Your back aches from bending over tables long after daylight. Your clothes are stained with dust and mystery and a little despair. Emotionally, it's worse. You can't unsee the faces. The hands that never moved again. The smiles frozen in time, twisted now into something else. And sometimes, when the fog rolls thick, you swear you hear whispers. Not curses. Not warnings. Just memories. Remember me. Don't forget. Why did you come? You tell yourself it's nonsense, that you're imagining things, that ghosts don't exist, but the feeling lingers. And the eyes. Oh, the eyes. Even when gone, they haunt you. They follow you down dark alleys. They peer from cracked mirrors. They lie just beneath the skin, in the spaces between breaths. You wonder how you forget them, if you ever can. You think about the woman you unwrapped last. The chipped molar, the knife scar, the turquoise scarab, the way her lips might have smiled before the world went dark. You think about Ti, Epet, Nesbane, Dejadet, names pulled from history by scraps of papyrus, whispers from dusty tomes. You think about their stories, unfinished, interrupted, appropriated, and you ask yourself, what did you do? Not just with your hands, but with your soul. You try to live with it, to bury it deep, to move on. But sometimes, the past unwraps you. So yeah, breathe that in, dust and all, because your life after the wrappings is not just about death. It's about survival, about carrying pieces of history no one else can see, about living with the weight of stories you weren't meant to tell. And maybe, just maybe, it's about finding a way to honor those stories without unwrapping them again. It's been decades since your first unwrapping. The city's changed. Less smoke, more electric light. The old mansions are quieter now. The dinner parties fewer. Even the museum halls echo with a softer, more careful kind of reverence. But one thing hasn't changed. You still think about them, about all the bodies, all the lives, all the stories that passed through your trembling hands. You find yourself drawn to the news. Egypt's in the headlines again. But this time, it's not for treasure hunting or circus exhibitions. It's for something gentler, something right. Repatriation. A word that would have made your old employers scoff. A word that means for the first time in centuries, someone is listening. Crates are going the other direction now. Homeward. The process is slow, bureaucratic, tangled in paperwork. But for once, the weight in those crates is honored. There are ceremonies, prayers, moments of silence. The media covers it not as spectacle, but as an act of restoration. You see a photograph, grainy, black and white, of Egyptian curators opening a returned coffin. Their faces are solemn, tender. They don't reach for scalpels or knives. They reach for names, for memory. Museums change their displays. Some add curtains around the dead, so visitors can choose whether to look or not. Some remove the bodies entirely, showing instead the artifacts, the stories, the context, letting the dead rest, unseen. You walk through one such museum. The sarcophagi are still there, but the glass is thicker, the lights are dimmer. There are signs carefully worded about dignity, about respect, about return. A group of school children passes, whispering, eyes wide. The guide tells them, these people were mothers, fathers, workers, priests. They are not curiosities. They are not displays. They are our connection to the past. You pause beside one display, an empty plinth, where a mummy once lay. The card now reads, repatriated to Egypt, 2023. May she rest in peace. You feel a small ache of relief. It's not just the bodies that are returning. It's the stories, the names, the prayers. There are documentaries now, films about Egyptian archaeologists reclaiming their own history, interviews with families who still remember the legends, the rituals, the words whispered over the dead at dawn. It isn't perfect. Not every mummy goes home. Some are too damaged. Some are lost. Some remain hidden in archives and private collections. Their paperwork gone. Their names erased. But there is movement. There is change. And there is a new kind of mourning. Not for what was lost, but for what is finally being restored. You find yourself in a quiet chapel one evening. Candles flickering. The air thick with incense and memory. You light a candle for each name you remember. Each face you can't forget. You whisper the old prayers, in broken syllables, hoping someone hears. You're older now. Slower, but your hands are steady. You place your palm on the cold stone and close your eyes. Maybe dignity can be restored one sarcophagus at a time. Maybe history can be retold, not as spectacle, not as tragedy, but as witness. Maybe there's hope for healing, even for those who spent their lives unwrapping wounds. And as you step out into the quiet street, the city seems softer, gentler. The world moves on, but the past no longer feels quite so heavy. You look up at the moon, full, white, watchful. You think of the women and men whose sleep you disturbed, the dreams you opened, The prayers you never learned to say. You murmur an apology. You let the silence settle. And for the first time you feel something like peace. Let that sink in. Maybe finally the dead can rest. And maybe, just maybe, so can you. You reach the end of the story, and suddenly, it's quieter. Not the quiet of a mausoleum or a stuffy museum after hours, but the deep hush that comes when the city sleeps. A hush that feels almost holy, the way it settles over rooftops and rain-soaked stones and the gentle eternal temp. You lie back and let it all play through your mind. The faces you never knew, the hands you unwrapped, the secrets that sifted like sand between your fingers. Once you thought history was dead things, dead people, a catalogue of names and dates, dry as the dust you brushed from ancient skin. But it's never been that simple, has it? History is the long, slow work of remembering. It's every word spoken over the bones, every name written, lost, and sometimes found again. It's the ache of stories buried too long, the strange weight of standing in a museum and realizing that the past isn't asleep at all. It's only waiting for someone to listen, someone to breathe life back into the silence. You used to think all this was just boring history, fodder for bedtime, for yawning schoolchildren and scholars who'd rather argue than feel. But after all you've seen, all you've done, you know better. You know that history isn't boring. It's heavy. It's wild. It's so deeply, stubbornly alive that even in its most undignified chapters, even when it's been paraded, dissected, powdered and consumed, it still hums beneath the linen, waiting. Sometimes you wish you could go back to that first unwrapping, before your hands trembled, before your conscience woke up, before you learned to see faces in every bone. You wish you could whisper to your younger self, slow down, this matters, this is someone. But time, as you've learned, only moves forward. So you remember the priestess and the scribe, the girl with the scar on her thigh, the shopkeeper with the list of reeds and oil and flour. You remember Tia and Apet and Nesbendodita. You remember the ones whose names you never knew, and you try quietly, stubbornly to honor them now. You honor them by telling the truth, by pausing to say, this was not just a body, this was a life, a longing, a hope for eternity. You honor them by refusing to let their stories be reduced to sideshows or party tricks, by refusing to let history be just a list of thefts and errors and powdered regrets. You honor them by making space, even now, for memory, for grief, for gentleness. Because that's the lesson, isn't it? Not that the Victorians were monsters, or that you were, or that everyone who came before you was doomed to repeat the same old cruelties, but that it's always been hard to see the dead as living ones, and that the work of really remembering is never finished. You think of the museum cards, the new ones, written with care. Her story is still being uncovered. You think of the repatriation ceremonies, awkward, bureaucratic, sometimes so quietly moving that you have to step outside just to breathe. You think of the next generation, the children learning that history is not a static thing, but a living one, that we can make amends, even clumsily, that we can listen better. And now, as the night draws in and the streetlights fade, you feel it at last, a soft loosening in your chest. The forgiveness that only comes when you stop running from what you did and start learning from it. This, you realize, is how history helps us sleep, not by boring us, not by dulling us, but by showing us that memory, however flawed, however incomplete, matters. By letting us rest, knowing that someone, somewhere, still cares enough to get the story right. So you lie back, close your eyes. The city is quiet outside. The ghosts are quieter still. You breathe in the memory of linen and dust, not as a burden, but as a gentle presence. A story with its rough edges worn smooth by time. Let the stories rest, and maybe you can too. Thank you for coming all this way. Thank you for remembering. Thank you most of all for listening. Good night. If you made it this far, you're not just here for the mummies, you're here for the humanity buried underneath. So hit that subscribe button, leave a comment with your weirdest history question, and remember, bedtime stories aren't just for kids, especially not when they involve corpses and corsets.